So we're turning back the clock. If you recall, Canada joined the UN war, or the protection of civilians in Libya back in 2011. And these are two of our former cabinet ministers in Canada. This is John Baird, Minister of Foreign Affairs, said we did it to protect civilians. Our Minister of Defense, Peter MacKay, said we did it in order to save lives. So we're going to hold them at that word because we believe what they say. And so we want to look, if that's what our terms of reference are, how did we do? And it's interesting, the cost of that military mission was $347 million overall. Go ahead. And guess what? We were successful. It was a successful mission because Gaddafi was no longer in office. It was officially deemed a success, and the government threw an $800,000 party. So I'm just going to write these figures on the board, even though I'm not the economist. And 800,000. Don't have to do any carrying. Anyway, so this is our budget that we're going to work with. Okay, go ahead. Long-term consequences. I'm not going to give you much because I don't think I need to give you this recent history lesson. But this is a report that was actually put out by England just within the last few weeks, and this is an excerpt. The long-term consequences of the NATO incursion was political and economic collapse, inter-militia and inter-tribal warfare, humanitarian and migrant crises, widespread human rights violations, the spread of Gaddafi-redeemed weapons across the region, and the growth of ISIL in North Africa. In short terms, it is a failed state on the brink of full-on civil war. So that's where we are. So what if we had used nonviolence? And was there a better way to support the Arab Spring? So we're going to use the model of unarmed civilian peacekeeping, which you may have heard from other sessions in this conference. Unarmed civilian peacekeeping, very briefly, is the utilization of trained professionals to engage in volatile areas to reduce violence through a specific means. And this is just a quick diagram of typically what they are: interpositioning, protective accompaniment, protective presence, confidence building, training, early warning, early response. That's just kind of a model. I'm not going to go into that too much for time. So what would that have looked like? And can you imagine if Canada, through a Department of Peace, had responded to this urgent humanitarian issue and responded to a growing group within Libya itself who wanted to depose the country of a ruthless dictator and wanted to bring about, as our minister said, save lives and, what was the other one? What did our minister say? Protect civilians. Okay, so let's just pretend we had sent in a cadre of unarmed civilian peacekeepers. So the UCP people are not activists. They are there actually to support on the ground the grassroots movement. And so that's the difference. And so they really are there to create space and so that the indigenous, nonviolent, grassroots, community-based activists can do their job. Go ahead. We know actually that this works. And these are graphs that Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan produced. Many of you know their work. And those of you who don't, they produced a book that was published about 5 years ago comparing hundreds and hundreds of nonviolent and violent campaigns over the last about 110 years. And they systematically looked at what was more successful. And they showed that nonviolent campaigns actually to overthrow governments, to bring about democracy, were significantly more successful. Okay, next slide. Also showed that the rate of success of nonviolence increased significantly as time progressed over the last number of decades. And what's the probability of being a democracy 5 years after the conflict had ended? If it were a violent campaign, 4%, non-violent campaign, 41%. Very strong statistical significance for that. Next one. Oh, sorry, I didn't. Okay, another just probability of experience of civil war within 10 years of any conflict. If it were a violent campaign, 43%, nonviolent campaign, 28%. Again, statistical significance is not quite as rigorous, but still definitely demonstrating a correlation. Does anyone have any that was just a real quick overview, just about the evidence about nonviolent resistance, how it works. Okay. So what we wanted to do, though, is look at what other things could we use to have, if we turn back to time, to demonstrate what could have worked. I'm going to turn it over to you.
So clearly with the work that Chenoweth and her partner did, there was some very strong evidence that the nonviolent means were more successful in a very meaningful way. But they're difficult to measure the impacts on society, and a lot of decision makers tend to gravitate towards monetary arguments where it's easy to create some sort of a cost-benefit analysis. So what we decided to do was take the work that was started by Chenoweth, who created, as Randy mentioned, I believe a 104-year survey of countries that had been engaged in both violent and nonviolent resistance over that period. It was, I believe, 3,000 entries of information. So we started to look at that from an economic perspective, and we'll kick over to the next one. And we can jump that one too. I want to get to our, yes. So now I get to be economic-y on you. One of the very most standard models that we see in economics is that we've got some sort of a measure of output as some function of capital and labor combined. This is very simple, and we can come up with all sorts of elaborations on it. We can get creative in how we consider output, what it includes, whether that should be increases in the quality of natural capital. We could look at social elements of it, but they're harder to measure. So the typical economist will look at the production that's sold in open markets with an easy monetary backing. Under this model, using this, we find that the function here is just some measurement of the type of technology that we use to bring together capital and labor together. And this is very standard, accepted by most economists and used by most economists in projections of the macroeconomy. If this is the case, then our rate of economic growth, or increasing our access to goods, services, and measurements of well-being, is dependent on three big things: our rate of technological advancement, our quantity and quality of capital that's available to our productive system, the quantity and quality of labor that's available to that productive system. So if true, the rate of capital accumulation is a very important factor in determining our rate of growth overall. And we can kick over to the next one. No surprises, it's very well understood by economists as well that violence leads to destruction of our infrastructure, destruction of our capital stock, and the destruction or the abasement of our labor pool as well, with great loss of life. And it creates a tumultuous economic environment which leads to economic downturns. Particularly leads to a low rate of savings, because people will have less faith in the system to which they're entrusting their money, and will have less money to set aside for savings. And savings is our biggest pool of loanable funds, or our source that we grow capital from, in taking that money and converting that into hard capital and infrastructure. So what we wanted to do was take a look at wealth as a proxy for savings. It's certainly determined by our rate of savings. We've got very good numbers from the UN, from the World Bank, on the rate of wealth accumulation and on the gross quantity of it. We've also got very, very well established figures on GDP around the entire world. On the rates of growth, we've got population figures from around the world. Using the Chenoweth data set, we took a look at the primary means of agitating for this sort of political change, be it violent or non-violent. And we wanted to look at this relationship. We've got some sort of a function around our growth and our total level of GDP production, or what's going on in the country in terms of creating stuff. We've got population changes, and we've got some sort of a measure. And we limited our examination to just those countries that had gone through some sort of a political upheaval, be it violent or non-violent. And our hypothesis was that we should see a decrease in the rate of wealth accumulation or overall level of wealth when we've got a primary means of achieving the political change being violent, leading to that destruction. So unfortunately, our fellow who did this statistical analysis, I built the model with Nur, but he would be far better able to answer questions about the technical side of this model if anyone were interested. But this is the model that we looked at. We looked at a function of wealth. The ln simply means we took a logarithm of it for mathematical reasons. We had some sort of a value in here, some sort of a starting point. We had factors in front of the line of our GDP. We set it back thinking that the previous year's GDP growth would have a bigger influence on current wealth accumulation than the current year would. We looked back 2 years. We looked at populations over a 2-year period, and we also looked at this primary means of violence. We looked at this across, I believe we had somewhere in the order of 400 or 500 cases that we looked at around the world, across time and across countries. And when we did our analysis of this, what we expected to see, sorry, one back there, Randy. We expected to see a negative number here in front of the primary means of achieving this change. If it were violent, it should have a negative impact on our wealth accumulation. Tell that we just fabricated these fairly recently. I've got to read them to see what we've said, which is just summarizing what we've just discussed. So what we did find when we ran our statistical analysis on this using panel data means, we did find a negative figure in front of that primary means of achieving the political change. Now, again, I wish we had our statistician with us. These are fairly weakly significant, but significant results, meaning that this does have approximately a 90% probability of being a significant factor in determining the rate of wealth accumulation. This is not a staggeringly strong result, but we were also doing this kind of off the side of our desks, and it's encouraging enough that we'd like to see a little bit more work done on this to elaborate on the model and to look in a slightly more comprehensive way to develop the model and to dig in a little bit deeper into how strong this impact is. Essentially what we're saying, though, is that we can have an economic argument that if you decide to go down the road of violent upheaval, it's going to have a negative long-term impact on your economy's growth and on the well-being of the people within that nation. Bringing in this monetary argument into this, where we've got very strong results showing that the effective results of the nonviolent means of political change are far more effective in terms of affecting an actual change in the government, the long-lasting level of democracy, and the other figures that Chenoweth looked at. And
do you want me to speak to this, or?
I think you could, Randy. That's my chunk that I would like to share with you.
Okay, please feel free to jump in. So we think this is, there's some good implications about this. I think we were able to just show, statistically that we all kind of know that there's short-term implication about going off to war, but this demonstrates there's a correlation for long-term implications for, it makes sense, according to this, to support nonviolent means, in the case of Libya, because the long-term economic output is agreeable. Again, this correlates with the seminal work done by Chenoweth and Stefan, and just again provides some empirical support for that innovative methods that support foreign policy goals for the Canadian government. I think, as you stated initially, when you speak to politicians, economics is almost always at the forefront of what we talk about when we try and get elected, right? And we need to push the envelope on this so that this type of stuff is talked about. I think there's one more slide. So this is, I think, what we, this was not that hard a study, I say, is the one who didn't do any of the math. But it kind of opens the door for a lot of other questions. We need to do more cost analysis of unarmed civilian peacekeeping. We have a budget of $340 million, $800,000, because we're not going to hold a party. We're just going to have a big potluck at the end of it. So what would that look like if we had that much money and we could have, how could we have supported the nonviolent uprising in Libya? Because it did exist, and similar to how you talk about in Ireland, we never heard about it, and it got co-opted very quickly. So I think if we turn back the clock, we could have supported that, especially with a hefty budget. The other thing is, especially with climate change, that we need to add is there is such a huge saving as far as carbon output if you want to respond in a nonviolent way for obvious reasons. Yeah, and also we need to think about more of the questions how we can bring this stuff and actually influence policy, and I think that comes more to the work you're doing as well. And I think that's it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.